He walked into that hall believing he was ending a war. By midnight, he understood he had walked straight into one. The candles were still burning. The vows had barely settled in the air. And somewhere between the last toast and the turn of the hour, the Alpha discovered that his death had been arranged before the first guest ever arrived. Someone in that room had signed his name on a death order, and the woman standing beside him in white, the one who had just promised him loyalty in front of every leader in the kingdom, had known about it all along. But here is the part no one was supposed to find out. She had tried to stop it. Now the doors were sealed, the castle was surrounded, the allies were enemies, and the enemies were smiling. And the only two people who knew the truth were standing side by side, holding each other's hands in front of a crowd waiting for one of them to fall. They had to keep smiling. They had to keep pretending. Because the moment anyone in that room realized they both knew, the night would end for both of them. And somewhere inside those walls, the person who started all of this was still watching. This is the kind of story that stays with you, not because of the swords, not because of the politics, but because of what it feels like to be trapped in a room full of people who want you dead and have to act like everything is fine. There is something deeply human about that, about having to hold your face perfectly still while everything inside you is screaming, about looking at a stranger and realizing in the same breath that they might be the only person left who is actually on your side. If that already has something moving in your chest, if you already feel like you need to know what happens next, you are exactly where this story wants you, because what comes after this moment is not just a survival story. It is a story about trust being built in the most impossible place imaginable. Two people who had every reason to destroy each other, choosing, are in the middle of a war no one else could even see, to protect each other instead. And the closer they get to finding out who is behind all of this, the more dangerous that choice becomes. The answer is already inside that castle, and when it finally comes out, it is going to change everything you thought you understood about loyalty, power, and what it actually costs to survive a peace that was never meant to last. Stay with me. The war had no single beginning. That was the first thing anyone who lived through it would tell you, if they were willing to speak of it at all. It did not start with a declaration, or a battle, or even a single act of cruelty. It started the way most wars between powerful families start, with a wound that was never allowed to heal, wrapped in pride and passed down through generations, until no one could quite remember who had struck first. By the time the Alcatias of Dawnspire and Ashvale had buried their 10th generation of soldiers, the war had become less about territory and more about identity. To stop fighting meant admitting that all those deaths had meant nothing, and that was the one truth neither side could afford to face. So they kept going. They kept going through droughts and famines and the kind of winters that kill the old and the very young first. They kept going through alliances that collapsed, through betrayals that reshaped borders overnight, through seasons where the bodies had to be left where they fell because there was no one left strong enough to carry them. The land between the two Alcatias, a stretch of hills and river valleys that had once been considered some of the most fertile ground in the kingdom, had been reduced to something that looked like the surface of a wound. Nothing grew there anymore. The rivers ran cloudy. The villages had been burned so many times that even the ruins were ruins. It was into this world that the idea of a marriage was introduced, not as a romantic proposal, not even as a gesture of goodwill. It was introduced the way all truly dangerous ideas are introduced, quietly, practically, disguised as the only reasonable option left. Caius Renvar heard the proposal in the great hall of his own keep, surrounded by advisors whose faces had grown permanently lined with exhaustion. He was the Alpha of Dawnspire, 29 years old, with the kind of stillness in his expression that people mistook for coldness until they understood it was actually control. He had inherited this war at 17, the same week he inherited everything else, and he had spent 12 years learning how to carry both. The proposal was simple. He would take as his mate the daughter of the Ashvale bloodline. A ceremony would be held at the border castle of Varentold, on neutral ground, witnessed by representatives of every major Alcatia in the kingdom. The war would formally end. Trade routes would reopen. The dead would stop accumulating. He asked for a day to consider it. He did not need a day. He had already known this was coming. He had known it the way you know a storm is coming, when the air pressure changes and the birds go silent. Not from logic, not from intelligence reports, but from the particular weight the world takes on before something inevitable arrives. He spent the day not deciding, but preparing himself for what it would mean to say yes. Because saying yes meant trusting people he had spent his entire adult life fighting. Tas meant walking into Warenthold, which sat technically on neutral ground, but was staffed almost entirely by Ashvile loyalists, and placing his life in the hands of a peace he had no reason to believe was genuine. But his kingdom was bleeding to death. And sometimes you accept the terms you are given, not because you trust the person offering them, but because the alternative is watching everything you were sworn to protect turn to ash. He said yes. Her name was Seraphine Vale, and she had been told about the marriage the same way she had been told about most of the significant events in her life, after the decision had already been made by people who assumed her agreement was a formality. She was 24, the third daughter of the Ashvale Council's most powerful figure, her father Marin Vielle, a man whose political instincts were matched only by his absolute conviction that everyone around him existed primarily to serve his ambitions. Seraphine had grown up in the specific kind of loneliness that exists inside large, wealthy, powerful families, surrounded by people at all times, genuinely known by none of them. She had learned early that the safest version of herself was the quiet one, the one who listened more than she spoke, the one who noticed things and said nothing. She had noticed a great many things over the years. When her father came to her 3 weeks before the ceremony and explained, in a tone that brooked no discussion, that she would be marrying Caius Renvar of Dawnspire, she did not cry. She did not argue. She asked 2 questions, when and what she was expected to wear. Her father looked briefly surprised by the absence of protest, then pleased, then immediately distracted by something else. He left the room already moving on to other considerations. Seraphine sat in the chair he had vacated and looked at the wall and thought about what she knew about Caius Renvar. She had heard he was intelligent. She had heard he was controlled. She had heard that he had a habit of going very still when he was calculating something, the way a predator goes still before it moves. None of that frightened her. What frightened her was something else entirely, something she had overheard 3 days earlier, in a corridor she had no official reason to be walking through, in a conversation between 2 men who believed they were alone. She had not heard everything. She had heard enough. She spent the following days in a state of controlled terror, moving through the preparations for the ceremony with the careful, deliberate performance of a woman who had no idea what was being planned around her. She smiled when she was supposed to smile. She submitted to fittings for the dress, which was white and heavy and elaborate, the kind of garment that makes movement difficult and escape impossible. She accepted the congratulations of people who knew what was going to happen and was careful to look at none of them long enough for her expression to shift. All the while she was trying to find a way to stop it. She had no allies she was certain of. That was the problem. The conspiracy, and it was a conspiracy, she understood that much clearly, ran through her father's household like a thread through fabric. She could not pull on any single part of it without risking the whole thing unraveling in her hands, with her in the middle of it. The men she might have trusted with the information were either complicit or too frightened to act. The women in the household had no political power and would not be believed. She considered briefly sending an anonymous message to Caius Renvar's camp, but dismissed it immediately. An anonymous warning delivered on the eve of a peace ceremony would more likely be interpreted as a provocation than a genuine alert. It might even accelerate the timeline. She kept looking for another way. She found none. The morning of the ceremony arrived, and she dressed in that impossible white gown, and she walked into the great hall of Warenthold, and she looked at Caius Renvar standing at the end of the aisle and thought, "I am so sorry. I tried." And then she made her expression do what it always did, go perfectly, professionally still, and she walked toward him. In that world, alliances were only wars wearing elegant clothes. Warenthold was a castle that had been built for exactly this kind of occasion. It sat at the precise midpoint between Dawnspire and Ashvile territory, perched on a ridge, overlooking the scarred valley below, its stones a pale grey that turned almost silver in certain light. It had hosted 3 previous peace negotiations, none of which had lasted. The people who staffed it had the particular expertise of those who have watched important things fail and learned to maintain a professional neutrality about the outcome. They set the tables, they lit the candles, they arranged the flowers. They did not speculate about whether this one would be different. The great hall had been dressed with the colours of both Alcatiers, the deep gold of Dawnspire, interwoven with the dark green of Ashvale, wrapped around the pillars and draped from the ceiling in a gesture of balance that fooled no one but offended everyone a little less than the alternative. Nobles and representatives from a dozen other Alcatiers filled the rows of chairs, watching with the intense evaluative attention of people who understood they were witnessing something that would reshape the political landscape regardless of how it ended. Some of them were genuinely hoping for peace, others were calculating what the peace, or its failure, would mean for their own positions. Several of the men in that room were waiting for a signal that had nothing to do with the ceremony. Caius Renvar stood at the front of the hall with his second, a man named Doran Vex, whose loyalty was the one thing in Caius's life that had never once been ambiguous. Doran was older by a decade, grey at the temples, possessed of the kind of face that never fully relaxed. He had served Caius's father and survived the transition to Caius with both his position and his principles intact, which was rarer than it should have been. He stood slightly behind Caius's right shoulder and said nothing, because he had learned that Caius preferred silence before important events and conversation after them. What he could not have known was that Caius was already aware something was wrong. It had been a servant, a young man from the border regions, technically employed by Varenthold, but recruited months earlier by one of Dawnspire's intelligence contacts. He had found Caius that morning in the private chamber, assigned to the Dawnspire delegation, pale-faced and shaking, with a piece of information that had clearly been burning a hole through him for days, and that he had only just gathered the courage to deliver. The young man's name was Finn. He was 17 years old, and had not yet learned to modulate the expression on his face when he was terrified. He told Caius what he knew in a low, rapid voice, his eyes moving constantly to the door. The plan, as he understood it, was for the assassination to occur during or immediately after the exchange of vows, a moment when attention would be concentrated on the couple, when Caius would be standing still, when the crowd would provide confusion and cover. The method was still unclear to him. The location of the primary actors was not. Caius listened to all of it without interrupting. When Finn finished, Caius looked at him for a moment in silence, then asked 3 precise questions. Who had told him this? How certain was he of the information, and had he told anyone else? Finn answered all 3. Caius thanked him, told him to return to his normal duties and behave exactly as he would on any other day, and then stood alone in the center of the room for approximately 90 seconds after the door closed. Then he called Doran in and told him to listen carefully and say nothing until he was finished. Doran's face did not change during the account. It was one of the things Caius had always valued most about him. When Caius finished, Doran was quiet for a moment, and then said flatly, "We leave." "We don't," Caius said. "You just told me there is an active assassination plan in this building, and your proposed solution is to attend the ceremony anyway." "My proposed solution is to attend the ceremony, complete the vows, and use the next several hours to find out exactly who is behind this and how far it goes before anyone realizes we know." Doran looked at him with the expression he reserved for moments when he believed Caius was being strategically correct and personally reckless in equal measure. "And if the intelligence is wrong? Then we've conducted a peace ceremony under marginally uncomfortable circumstances and gone home having lost nothing. And if it's right? Then leaving now announces to everyone in this castle that we know, which means the people behind this spend the next 3 months rebuilding their plan somewhere we can't see it, and we spend the next 3 months wondering when it's coming." Caius straightened his jacket. "At least here, I know the shape of the threat." There was a long pause. I hate it when you're right about things that could get you killed, Doran said. I know. What do you need from me? Caius told him. Then he walked out to stand at the front of the great hall, and he watched Seraphine Vielle walk toward him in that impossible white dress, and he studied her face with the careful attention of someone who needed to know, before anything else, whether she was part of it. She was not easy to read. He noticed that immediately. There was a quality to her stillness that was practiced, not the artificial calm of someone performing composure, but the genuine internal architecture of someone who had spent years learning to manage the distance between what they felt and what they showed. He recognized it because he had built the same architecture in himself. What he could not determine in those first moments was what she was using it to hide. The ceremony proceeded. The words were said. The representatives watched. The candles burned. Caius spoke his vows in a clear, measured voice and looked at Seraphine and tried to read the thing beneath the stillness, the signal that would tell him whether she was a weapon or a witness. She met his eyes steadily. She said her own vows without hesitation. Her hands, when they briefly held his, were cold. Afterwards, during the reception, he stayed close to her without making it obvious, partly because proximity to her was expected of a newly joined mate, partly because she was the most important variable in a situation full of dangerous variables, and he preferred to keep his most important variables inside arm's reach. He was watching her face when she saw something across the room. It was a small thing, a tightening around her eyes, a barely perceptible shift in her posture, gone almost as quickly as it appeared. But he had been watching for exactly that kind of thing, and he caught it, and he followed her gaze. It led him to a man he did not recognize, middle-aged, unremarkable in appearance, standing near one of the side doors with a cup of wine he was not drinking. The man looked at Seraphine for exactly 2 seconds. Something passed between them that Caius could not name. Then the man turned and walked through the side door and was gone. 2 hours later, a servant who had been assigned to the Dawnspire delegation was found dead in one of the back corridors. It was not Finn. Finn was alive and doing what he had been told, moving through the castle with the practiced unremarkability of someone who understood that visibility was dangerous. The dead servant was a man named Petch, older, who had been with the Dawnspire household for 11 years, and who apparently had made the mistake of being in the wrong place when someone needed to ensure a particular route through the castle remained unobserved. Caius was told about it quietly, discreetly, in the space between one conversation and the next, by Doran, who had developed a method over the years of delivering devastating information in a tone that sounded like a comment about the weather. Caius absorbed it without showing anything. He was standing in a group of nobles at the time, one of whom was making a long, elaborate point about agricultural policy, and he nodded at the appropriate moments and felt the temperature of the situation shift several degrees in his internal calculations. Petch had not been a spy. He had just been a servant who was in the wrong place. The fact that he was dead meant the timeline was tightening. Whoever was running this was clearing obstacles, which meant they were moving towards something. Tonight. It was going to be tonight. He excused himself from the agricultural policy, conversation with a graceful, unhurried apology, and went looking for his wife. He found her on one of the upper terraces, standing at the stone railing, looking out over the valley below. The light was failing, the sky moving through that particular shade of deep blue that exists just before it becomes fully dark. She had a glass of wine she was not drinking. She turned when she heard his footsteps, and her expression did that thing, the careful, practiced settling into neutrality, but not quickly enough. He caught what was underneath it for just a fraction of a second. It looked, he thought, like relief. That was not what he had expected. He came to stand beside her at the railing, and they were both quiet for a moment, looking out at the valley in a way that to anyone observing from inside would have looked like the studied intimacy of 2 people learning the shape of being together. From this angle, from this distance, they would have looked like a couple. He was aware of that. He was aware of everything. "You saw something," he said. His voice was completely conversational, stripped of anything that could be read as threat or accusation. In the hall, during the reception, the man near the east door. The silence that followed was only a few seconds long, but inside those seconds an enormous amount happened. He felt it, the recalibration, the rapid internal weighing of options, the arrival at a decision. Her hands were still on the railing. She did not look at him. "I don't know what you mean," she said. "That's a reasonable answer," he said. "It's also a lie, which is your prerogative, and which I would completely understand given the circumstances. But I want to tell you something first, and then you can decide how to respond." She waited. "I know about the plan," he said. "I've known since this morning. I completed the ceremony anyway, which you may find strange. I completed it because leaving would have announced what I knew, and announcing what I knew would have removed the only advantage I currently have in this building, which is that the people who want me dead believe I am unaware of them." He paused. "I am telling you this because I watched your face during the reception, and you are either extraordinarily good at pretending to be frightened of the situation, or you are genuinely frightened of the situation, and I need to know which one it is before tonight goes any further." Another silence. Longer this time. When she turned to look at him, the stillness in her face was still there, but underneath it something had shifted, something had decided. "I found out 3 days ago," she said. "I tried to find a way to warn you. I couldn't find one that didn't put me directly in the middle of it. My father's people are throughout this castle. The man you saw near the east door, he's one of my father's. I don't know his name. I know what he's here to do." "Which is?" "Coordinate the timing. The plan isn't just to kill you. There are people in this hall with connections to at least 4 other Alcatias who have been promised something in the aftermath. Land, titles, trade concessions, whatever was needed to buy their silence or their participation." She looked back at the valley. "I don't know all of it. I heard pieces. Enough to understand that if you die tonight, the peace doesn't just end. What follows is supposed to look like Dawnspire started it. A renewed war, but this time with your Alcatia as the clear aggressor, politically isolated and fighting on multiple fronts." Caius was quiet for a moment. He had understood it was an assassination plot. He had not fully understood until now the scope of what came after. "Your father," he said, "he believes he can control what comes next. He believes he'll be able to position Ashvale as the injured party, the stabilizing force, the only reasonable choice for others to align with." Something moved across her face, too complicated to name, a layering of emotions that had no clean resolution. "He may be right. He's usually right about these things. That's what makes him dangerous." "Does he know you know?" "No." "Are you certain?" The pause was fractional. "Reasonably certain." That was honest, he thought. A less careful person would have said yes without hesitation. "All right," he said. "Here is where we are. We are in a castle that is staffed primarily by people who are either complicit or uninformed. We cannot trust the guards. We cannot trust most of the nobility currently inside. We cannot leave without triggering the contingency plans your father has clearly built into this. If we are going to survive the night, we need to do it from inside this building, which means we need information I don't currently have." He looked at her directly. "How much do you know about the castle layout?" Something that might, in other circumstances, have been almost amusement moved briefly across her face. "More than they think I do." "Good, then here is what I need from you." They did not stay on the terrace long enough to arouse concern. They returned to the great hall together, moving through the space with the unhurried ease of a couple making the rounds of their own celebration, speaking to the right people, accepting congratulations, performing the evening with the collective discipline of 2 people who had both, for different reasons, learned how to be one thing on the surface while being something entirely different underneath. It was, Caius thought, a strange kind of marriage preparation. He watched her work the room with new attention. She was exceptional at it, the precise calibration of warmth and formality, the way she gave each person she spoke to the impression that they had her full attention without ever quite revealing what she actually thought of them. She had been doing this her entire life. He could see the architecture of it, the years of practice, the specific survival skill of someone who had grown up in a house full of dangerous people and had learned to navigate it through intelligence and performance rather than power or force. He found himself thinking that under different circumstances, she would have been a remarkable political ally. Then he corrected himself. She was a remarkable political ally. That was rather the point. Doran materialized at his elbow at the precise moment he had arranged for him to, during a gap between conversations, and they had approximately 45 seconds of what looked like casual small talk, while Doran communicated 3 pieces of information. The East Wing corridor had been recently cleared of its usual staff. 2 of the Dawnspire guards stationed at the main entrance had been quietly replaced sometime in the last hour, and the man near the east door had been seen speaking to one of the Ashvale Council members, a figure named Renly Cross, who was known primarily as a creature of Marin Vael's political apparatus. Renly Cross. Caius noted it and filed it next to everything else. The evening moved forward with the specific, dreamlike quality of a situation in which everyone present was performing a version of events that was not quite the true version. The musicians played, the food was served and consumed, toasts were made. The whole elaborate machinery of a celebratory occasion ground forward, and underneath it, invisible to almost everyone in the room, an entirely different kind of machinery was also turning. At a certain point, late enough, in the evening that the volume of the room had risen with wine and relative relaxation, Seraphine found a moment to stand near him and say, in a voice pitched perfectly to carry no further than his ear, "The room they've prepared for us tonight. There's something wrong with it." He kept his expression social and pleasant. "What kind of wrong?" "The window locks have been changed, the ones on the west side. I noticed it when I was shown the room earlier. Those windows look out onto the secondary courtyard, which is the only part of the castle that doesn't have direct visibility from the guard towers." A brief, perfectly timed pause while she smiled at someone across the room. "If someone wanted to enter the room from outside while we slept, the west windows would be the way to do it." "Noted," he said. "Sleep is unlikely to be part of the evening's program anyway." "There's something else," she said. "One of the women who served during the ceremony, I recognized her. She worked in my father's household in Ashvale for 2 years before she disappeared from the staff records. Official explanation was that she left for family reasons. I know what that usually means in my father's household. He placed her here in advance. Months ago, at least, which means this wasn't improvised, this was built. He absorbed that. A planted operative, positioned months ahead of a peace ceremony that had only been formally proposed 8 weeks ago. Either the conspiracy had anticipated the proposal before it was made, or someone involved had helped to shape the proposal precisely in order to create this opportunity. That was a thought with significant implications. "Your father," he said carefully. "Was he involved in the initial proposal? The recommendation to pursue a marriage alliance? A beat. The recommendation came from the Joint Council, but the Joint Council's position on it shifted very quickly. Within a week of the first informal discussions, there was a strong consensus in favor. I always thought that was faster than the usual pace of—" She stopped. He watched the calculation happen in her face, the pieces assembling into a shape she had not previously considered. "He helped engineer the proposal," she said, "from the beginning. That would suggest the peace was never the goal." "No," she said quietly, "the peace was the bait." The guests began to depart for their assigned quarters as the night deepened. The great hall gradually emptied until it held only a handful of late-stayers who showed no interest in movement, and the staff moving silently through the space with the particular practiced invisibility of people paid to be unobtrusive. Caius and Seraphine made their way upstairs at the appropriate hour, accompanied by the expected retinue of well-wishers and ceremony, and were eventually deposited in the bridal chamber with elaborate good wishes and the closing of a door that felt, to both of them, rather more like the closing of a trap than the beginning of something private. They stood on opposite sides of the room for a moment. The chamber was large and expensively appointed, deep rugs, heavy drapes, candles throwing warm light across stone walls hung with tapestries. The west windows were tall, their locks newly changed exactly as Seraphine had described. A door to the left led to a dressing room. Another to the right was a secondary access point that appeared to be sealed from the outside. "Doran is in the room. Directly below," Caius said. "There's a servant's stair behind the dressing room that he can access. I've arranged a signal." "How?" "Specific knock pattern on the floor. We worked it out years ago for situations requiring discreet communication." He moved toward the west windows and examined the locks without touching them. "These are wax casts. Someone replaced the mechanism, but they used wax to hold it in the original position. If you're not looking for it, they move exactly the way normal. Locks do. From the outside, they can be opened with the right instrument in about 8 seconds. She came to look. "How do you know that?" "Because I've used the technique myself." She looked at him. There was something in the look. Not quite surprised, not quite not surprised. A reappraisal of some kind. "We need to be in this room," he said, "because leaving it would create questions we can't afford. But we also can't simply wait for whoever they send through those windows. So we need to be ready without appearing to be ready, which means leaving a visible impression that we're asleep," she said. "Pillows, and we're positioned somewhere they won't expect." The alcove behind the secondary door, it opens inward. From inside the alcove you can see the entire room, including the west windows, without being visible from any of the standard entry points. She was quiet for a moment. "You've used this room before." "I've studied the castle plans. I had 8 weeks to prepare for. This, which I used, among other things, to acquire as detailed a map of Varenthold as I could find." He paused. "It wasn't quite as detailed as I would have liked." "I know the parts that aren't on official maps," she said. "I was hoping you'd say something like that." They worked together with a kind of focused efficiency that asked nothing of sentiment or trust, only of necessity. The bed was arranged to suggest occupation. The candles were reduced to the ones that would naturally burn, themselves out within the hour. Seraphine, with the specific knowledge of someone who had grown up in a house that contained hidden things, identified a secondary exit from the dressing room that did not appear on any map Caius had reviewed, a narrow passage that had apparently been used by the castle's original owners for reasons that history had rendered obscure, and that connected to a perpendicular corridor that offered a route to the east wing without passing through any of the main hallways. "You're certain it's clear?" he asked. "I walked it this afternoon. I told the attendants I was looking for the washroom and got turned around." She said it without any particular satisfaction, just matter-of-factly, as if finding secret passages while preparing for a wedding ceremony was simply the kind of thing one did. "There's a door at the far end that leads to the servants' courtyard. From there you can access the stable block, and the stable block has a gate in the eastern wall that's supposed to be sealed for the evening but whose bolt has been rusting for approximately 3 years. He looked at her. "I checked," she said simply. "I try to know where the exits are." He found in that moment that he believed her. Not about everything, or not yet, not all at once. Trust was not something he distributed freely or rebuilt quickly, but he believed this specific thing, that she was not working against him tonight, that whatever her role had been in the architecture of this plan tonight she was, for reasons he did not yet fully understand, positioned on the same side of it as he was. That was enough to work with. They settled into the alcove and waited. The first hour was the specific kind of quiet that exists when everyone is pretending to be somewhere else. The castle's nighttime sounds moved through the walls, the distant rhythm of music that had not yet stopped, voices in corridors, the occasional shift of a guard's equipment. Normal sounds, or sounds, performing normality. Seraphine sat with her back against the inner wall of the alcove, the white dress a logistical problem she had addressed by bundling the excess fabric into her arms. In the dim light, Caius could see her profile, attentive, watchful, perfectly still in the way that he now understood was not composure for its own sake, but composure in service of observation. "The woman my father placed in the household," she said, in a voice barely above breath. "Her name is Lyra. She has access to the kitchens and the upper corridor servicing our room. She would have been the one to alter the window locks." "Probably," She was also the one who suggested to the head of staff that the Dawnspire servants be housed in the north wing rather than the east. At the time I thought it was just a standard issue of space allocation. Now I think she was clearing field of movement. Professional, he said. Your father recruits carefully. He does everything carefully. A pause. Except when he thinks he's already won. Then he gets efficient. He stops checking the parts he believes are already handled. Like you. A silence. Like me. There was something in the way she said it. Not self-pity, nothing so soft as that. Something more like a long-standing, factually established understanding. She had been treated as already handled for most of her life. She had chosen to use that treatment as the specific advantage it was. Invisibility in a house full of powerful people who were watching everything except her. He doesn't know you the way he thinks he does, Caius said. No. Does that make you angry? The question surprised her. He could see it in the small shift of her posture, the slight delay before she answered. It used to. Now it's just useful. She paused again. I should tell you something. All right. Before the ceremony, 2 days before, I wrote a message. I was going to have it sent to your camp through a contact outside the castle. One of the border traders who has connections on both sides. The message explained what I knew about the plan. He was very still. What happened to it? I burned it, she said, because the morning I was going to send it, I found out that the contact I was going to use had been on my father's payroll for the last 4 months. If I had sent it through him, it would have arrived as an intercepted warning from within the Ashvale delegation, which would have immediately implicated me and given my father the justification he needed to... She stopped. It would have made things worse. So you came anyway, he said. I came anyway. He thought about what it had cost her to walk into that hall, to say those vows, to stand beside someone she could not warn, knowing what was coming, with no plan except to survive the night and find another way. That was not nothing. That was the specific, terrible courage of someone with no good options, who chose the least catastrophic one and carried it without letting it show. He said very quietly, "Thank you." She looked at him. In the dim light of the alcove, with the white dress folded in her arms and the sound of the castle moving around them, she looked at him in a way that was entirely stripped of the performance layer, the practiced neutrality, the architecture of careful self-protection. Just a person, just a direct look. "Don't thank me yet," she said. "We're still in the castle." It came in the second hour. The west windows moved so quietly that, without specific attention, you would not have heard them, but both of them had been listening for exactly that sound, the precise, specific whisper of a lock designed to be noiseless, admitting to the defeat of its false mechanism. Caius's hand went to the blade at his side before conscious thought had completed itself. Beside him, Seraphine did not move at all, which he registered as the correct instinct. 2 figures came through the window. They moved with the practiced efficiency of people who had done this kind of thing before, low, fast toward the bed, instruments in hand. The moonlight came through the open window behind them and threw their shadows long and distorted across the floor. They reached the bed. The sound that followed, when they understood what was under the covers, was very small. Almost nothing. The specific silence of a plan arriving at the moment of its own failure. Caius was out of the alcove before either of them had turned fully around. What followed was brief and significantly unpleasant, and resolved itself in a way that left both of the figures occupying the floor rather than the upright position, and left Caius with a cut along his left forearm that was neither serious nor painless, and left Seraphine holding the secondary door open with an expression on her face that contained, somewhere underneath the carefully maintained focus, something that might have been a controlled form of shock. "The passage," he said. They moved. The narrow corridor was dark and close and smelled of old stone. Seraphine moved through it without hesitation, which meant she had not been performing when she said she had walked it. Behind them, the sounds of the castle had changed. Something had shifted in the quality of the silence, a tensing, a preparation. Someone had noticed or had been notified that the first stage of the plan had not completed as expected. Doran was going to know something had happened from the signal, or the absence of it. But Caius had no way to reach him without retracing the route, and retracing the route was no longer a reasonable option. They moved through the dark and came out on the servants' courtyard side, and the air was cold and clean after the corridor, and Seraphine moved immediately toward the stable block without pausing to establish her bearings. She knew exactly where she was. She had mapped this in her head. He found himself revising again his understanding of who she was and what she had been doing in the weeks before this evening. The stable gate's bolt was rusted, exactly as she had described. It took effort, but not excessive effort. They were through it and into the outer eastern grounds when the noise started inside the castle. Not a shout, not an alarm, but a specific kind of movement, a quickening, that to anyone who had been in enough dangerous situations was immediately identifiable as the sound of a plan escalating past its original parameters. Caius pulled Seraphine back, against the outer wall of the stable block, and they stood in the shadow of it, close enough together that he could feel the controlled, deliberate steadiness of her breathing, the rhythm of someone managing fear through the specific discipline of attention to breath. "They know we're not in the room," he said. "Yes. The plan moves to contingency, which means the gates will be locked from inside within the next 3 to 4 minutes," she said. "My father would have built a containment. Protocol. He always does. Once primary fails, secondary is containment and elimination rather than clean exit. Then we have 3 to 4 minutes. Or less," he thought with extraordinary speed. The main gate was already likely compromised. The eastern gate they had come through was narrow and would be checked. But Seraphine had said she knew the parts of the castle that weren't on official maps, and she had proved it once tonight. "Is there another way out of this ground?" he asked. In the darkness, he heard the small sound of her exhaling. "There's a place in the northern wall," she said. "Original construction, filled in but not bonded properly. I noticed it when we arrived. The mortar coloring is different. If you have the physical force to deal with approximately 2 feet of inadequately bonded stone, show me," he said. And she did. They came out on the hillside above the valley, with the castle lights behind them, and the sound of raised voices beginning to filter through. Varant holds walls like heat through stone, the distant, unmistakable reverberation of a situation coming apart at its seams. Caius's arm was bleeding steadily through the sleeve. Seraphine's dress was no longer entirely white. They were on a hillside in the middle of the night with no horses, no full intelligence picture, and a political situation that had just acquired approximately 12 new layers of catastrophic complication. He looked out over the dark valley and thought about the shape of what they had just survived and what it meant. The conspiracy was real and structural and went deeper than he had understood even an hour ago. It had been constructed over months. It had roots in both Alcatiers. It was designed not just to kill him, but to trigger a war under conditions designed to isolate Dawnspire politically and militarily, which meant that by morning, when news of the failed ceremony began to spread, whoever was controlling the narrative would be working to position tonight as something other than what it actually was. He had no way to reach Doran. He had his immediate intelligence, his capacity, and Seraphine. He looked at her. She was standing slightly apart from him, looking down at the valley with the controlled expression that he had now spent an entire evening learning to read past. Her hair had come partly loose from the elaborate arrangement required by the ceremony. The white of the dress in the moonlight was something that would, under circumstances, have been beautiful. "Your father will say you were taken," he said. "Yes." "That the Dawnspire Alpha kidnapped his daughter in the middle of the peace ceremony, a political abduction, justification for response." "Yes. He'll have people who will swear to it. He'll have the account from every Ashvale noble in that hall, all of whom will have been briefed by morning on what they witnessed." She paused. "It's a good story. It positions him cleanly, and it forces your Alcatia to defend against an accusation rather than make one. Then we need to provide a counter-narrative before he has time to fully establish the first one." "With what? We're on a hillside." "We're on a hillside," he said, with first-hand knowledge of a conspiracy that involves at least a dozen named actors, a planted operative, specific evidence of premeditation, and the daughter of the man behind it, who is prepared to say, publicly and on the record, exactly what she knows. Silence. "You'd need me to testify against my own family," she said. "I would need you to tell the truth about what you know," he said, "which you can choose to do or not. I'm not in a position to compel you, and I wouldn't if I were." He looked at her directly. "But I want you to understand something. If your father's narrative takes hold, this doesn't end. The war that follows is designed to leave nothing standing on the Dawnspire side. It is specifically constructed to be unwinnable, and the Alcatayas that get swept into it, all the others who were promised things tonight in exchange for their silence, they become complicit in something they may not have fully understood when they agreed to it." She was very quiet. "Thousands of people," he said, "not as manipulation, as fact. In both Alcatayas, in every Alcataya that gets pulled into what comes next." The sound from the castle had grown. There were lights moving on the lower grounds now, search parties beginning to organize. "I know a family," she said, quietly, "in the village at the foot of the northern ridge. They have no connection to any of this. I've known them for years. They were my mother's people before she died. My father doesn't know about them." She looked at him. "We can get there in 3 hours on foot. We can send messages from there. If Doran is who you say he is, and if you can reach him, I can reach him. Then we have a window, before my father finishes establishing the story, before the political machinery gets fully in motion." He looked at her. In the cold night air on the hillside above the ruined peace ceremony, with everything that had just happened behind them and everything that was coming ahead, he looked at Seraphine Vielle and understood something he had not fully considered during any part of the evening's preparations. She was not simply a source of intelligence. She was not simply a complication or a variable or a useful tool in a difficult situation. She was the only person in the kingdom who had known about the plan and chosen, at significant personal risk and with no guarantee of outcome, to stand on the wrong side of it. That was a thing. That was, in fact, the kind of thing that did not have an easy political category. It did not fit neatly into the calculations he was accustomed to making. He would need to think about that later, when they were not being actively hunted. 3 hours, he said. "Show me the way." And she turned north, lifting the remnants of the white dress out of the wet grass, and he walked beside her, and behind them the lights of Varenthold moved through the darkness in patterns that were becoming, with every passing minute, more urgent and less organized. The marriage that had been built to end a war had instead become the first night of something neither of them had planned, in a story that was not yet close to finished, where the most dangerous moves had not yet been made, and where the two people best positioned to understand the full shape of the conspiracy were walking away from it together into the dark, carrying between them a collection of secrets heavy enough to bring down every Alcataya in the kingdom, if they chose to use them. The valley below was quiet, the hills ahead were dark, and somewhere in the distance, 3 hours away, there was a house with no connection to any of this, and a fire, and a way to begin. Drop a comment with the words, "Still standing," if you felt that, because what's about to come next makes everything that happened tonight look like the opening move, and that is where we leave them for now, walking north, together, carrying the weight of a kingdom that doesn't yet know what's coming. If you stayed through all of it, through the ceremony, the alcove, the castle wall, the hillside, you already know this story has a particular kind of pull, the kind that doesn't let you look away, not because of the action, but because of what's underneath it. Two people who had every reason to be each other's enemies, choosing, in the middle of the most dangerous night of their lives, to trust each other anyway. That stays with you. If it stayed with you too, drop a comment right now and write "Still walking north," so I know exactly who made it to the end. And if this kind of storytelling is what you come here for, the subscribe button is the simplest way to make sure the next chapter finds you. There's a video right beside this one that picks up on a very similar energy. Different story, the same kind of world, the same kind of tension that builds slowly and then hits all at once. Click over when you're ready. I'll be there waiting.